everybody to the Ashford Teaching and Learning Conference. My name is Kate Johnson. I'm the Manager of Faculty Engagement at Ashford and excited to be your host for this session. Our presenter is Dr. Jeff Borden. Let me give you a quick bio on Dr. Borden, former Chief Innovation Officer at St. Leo University. Jeff is currently the Executive Director of the Institute for Interconnected Education and the Chief Academic Officer for the Accrued Digital Campus. Having spoken to educators at every level, from politicians to presidents to principals, in 38 countries and 49 of 50 US states, Dr. Borden is generating and communicating the best possible ideas, strategies, and philosophies to transform learning at scale. Having written editorials, blogs, and given interviews for dozens of academic and popular media, as well as having presented to more than 5,000 audience in 20 years, Dr. Borden will provide practical, research, intentional strategies for changing learning. Listen in as Jeff shares insights regarding educational technology, academic vision, rigorous research, and learning design. Help me welcome Dr. Jeff Borden.
Thank you. It's exciting to be able to do this. For anyone who's joining in that watched this live, the recording didn't work, so we're doing this again. But for those of you who didn't see it live, I want to try to make a little bit more use of the medium that we have here. And so as I jump in and talk about interconnected education, there might be some questions that come from this specific audience that will help hopefully clarify some things. At the same time, I'm going to commit to a teaching principle. So for those of you that don't know this, there is a lot to drawing. It actually helps the mind imagine all sorts of things. You might imagine as a professor of science, if you were trying to teach people what a heart was, and I know that's not a heart, but something that was an actual heart. What a lot of teachers will do is they'll go find a great high definition picture and they'll put that picture up and it'll have a lot of different labels coming in, and it will be really, really difficult for a novice who, in terms of cognitive load, that's overwhelming. Better is if instead I could draw a heart and I could start to talk about some of the different chambers in the heart, and I could talk about some of the different, the ventricle or whatever. And quite honestly, even better than that would be if the students were drawing it themselves. And that would give me some meat to be able to speak to on that bone, to be able to talk about how they were doing. Well, we probably can't do too much drawing back and forth. We don't have those tools here, but I can do some drawing for you. So I'm committing to do that as we go forward. And so let's get started by talking about interconnected education. For a long time, I went around the world talking to audiences about assets like you see here, assets that were quote unquote interactive. Things like what you see is called the scale of the universe. This was built on the Prezi platform and was developed to showcase the size of anything, the scale of anything. And so we would put these into e-learning modules and units and really try to help people find stuff that was a little more exciting, interesting, engaging. Unfortunately, as I did that for over a decade, it really soon came to be obvious it wasn't enough. There were some issues with things like active learning. The concept behind active learning was still something that was a struggle for a great deal of higher education, honestly for K through 20 education. Now you can see this survey that was taken by Harry that came out not too long ago that talks about still half of our classroom situations are extensive lecturing. They're just one person talking at a whole bunch of other people. The thing on here that's the most disturbing to me is actually this. They were heralding how now 80% of all faculty are in a place where they allow students to talk in class. But what that says to me is that there are still 20% of professors not allowing students to talk in class. That couldn't be any less active, really. That's just passive absorption. So I agree, it is crazy. So as I've tried to redevelop kind of my thinking about how we approach this stuff, and the Institute for Interconnected Education really has given me a nice platform to do that. Here's what we typically tell students to be better students. right? We give them statements like this: concentrated study sessions of rereading, reviewing, highlighting passages, underlining passages. We know those to not be effective, and people should not spend their time doing that. That doesn't lead to learning. It leads to short-term memorization at best. For some, it doesn't even lead to that. So when we start talking about real learning, I think we've got to go beyond the sort of institutional box we've put ourselves in. At the same time, we know that the reasons that people are struggling with education are largely not academic at all. About 75% of the reason people drop out is because they're lonely. They don't have support. They don't have family members who know how to help them. They don't have advising that's really giving them what they need. They don't have financial means. They're trying to work and balance that. They don't have food. There's all kinds of reasons that we now know why people drop out that have nothing to do with academics. And yet often we set student success squarely at the feet of academics and tell them to teach better or create a more engaging environment in your classroom. But it's everything put together. That to me is why I don't think it's a stretch to say that we are disconnected in higher education. We have created a disconnected experience, and that's really what I'm trying to help solve through the Institute for Interconnected Education. I've used this quote for a long time, and it's still true today. There is a gap between what scientists know about how our brains actually work and what organizational behaviorists will tell you that we do in multiple contexts and organizations. So what I'm really trying to get at today is how we can start to think about things not only correctly, but by using what we know to be true from research. Let me just give you a quick example. Learning. Learning, oops, went a little too far. Learning is quite transactional in nature. Most people think of it as a transaction. You've got one person who is talking to another person or persons, right? And because they were there while this person is presenting, they have learned. Unfortunately, we know that's not true. Learning does not work that way. In fact, learning does not only not work that way, but it can actually be detrimental if you consider learning to be quite that transactional. The illustration that I used when I was presenting this live was I asked people to take a shoe that had a tie on it, and I asked people to simply put that shoe up on the table and untie it and retie it for the people around them and explain what they were doing. Now, this is something we've all done from the time that we were very, very young. But after that was done, I then asked a simple question. What if you learned to tie your shoe wrong? There's a great TED Talk, came out about 10 years ago by Terry Moore, who goes in and describes how most of us were taught to tie our shoes incorrectly. As a result, we use a weak form of the knot that comes untied more often. It doesn't look quite as nice. And in fact, I can even entice people by saying, over the course of your lifetime, you will spend about an extra day and a half retying tied shoes. That's a lot of time to give away by the time that your life is said and done. However, I also was willing to bet that even though I had shown people a new way, I showed people the correct way to tie their shoes, or Terry did in this case, most people still would go back to the old way that they had done it. Why? Because that's what they know. That's what they learned. And when they learned it, it became so ingrained, they can probably do it now in the dark. They can do it with any kind of shoe. It's just so easy. They would rather deal with the headache of retying it, right? And the new way is also hard. It's different. It's unusual. Well, that's what learning really is, right? That's what learning represents. So that's one example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So yeah, I hope everyone can see the chat. If not, habits are tough to break, which is why Mike went with Velcro. Good job, Mike. This would be my resume if I were showing it to you in terms of education technology. This is my word cloud. These are the pieces and parts that make up who I am. Now in here you'll see that I'm the executive director. You might see I'm the chief academic officer. I blog a lot. I speak around the world a lot. But you might also see some things in here that are not professional in nature. I play the guitar. We have a dog. I've got a daughter named Addie. I think she's in there. Those things are all the disparate pieces that make up who I am. But it's not until you take this stuff and you put it into some kind of meaningful pattern that you get a decent sense of this guy who is talking to you on the camera. Well, what I want to talk about today are what I call the seeds of education, and there are a lot of them. Things that we deal with every day: critical thinking, computer literacy, controversy, change, creativity, curriculum. There are all of these C's that we're constantly trying to deal with, but the biggest one, from my perspective, really is connectedness. Whether that's connecting learning to outcomes, students to teachers, classroom experiences to real life, connection really does matter. And I really want to talk about those C's of education. And by the time we're done, I want to see if we don't have a little bit better pattern. And I'll use the same joke I used when I did this live. I want to navigate those C's better together so that we have a better sense of what connection really looks like in today's education paradigm. I often filter this through something I call Education 3.0. And that is the confluence of neuroscience, education psychology, and education technology. And where those things intersect in the middle, that is connected neuro-learning. Connection is crucial to getting across what we want in a way that's meaningful so that people take it with them and move on. So let's talk a little bit about connection. I want to do that by really describing some connection killers. I'm going to talk about the history of where education came from. I'm going to talk about a connection killer in learning, and those two things together will really speak to the paradigm that we use as a collective. So to do that, in order to talk about the history, I have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning, in terms of what we're going to talk about today, really goes back to about 1835. There was this man named Quetelet, and Quetelet was an astronomer. He really wanted to become the main astronomer for his country. And so he started to have a very, very large telescope built, and then he was going to put a planetarium around it and do all of those sorts of things that really showed that he had made it. Unfortunately, war broke out. And so he wasn't able to build his giant telescope and look at the stars or look at the planets. And so instead, he took his acumen in terms of being a pretty smart guy and being able to do math and some things that not a lot of people in society could do back then. And he said, I want to focus my attention, instead of on the stars, I want to focus it at society. Because for the first time, we really started to see data come out about society. We knew about suicide rates. We knew about the poor. We knew about the rich. We knew about salaries. We started to collect data and distribute it for the first time ever. And so Quetelet started to do something that was interesting. It bothered him how hard it was to predict what man would do. See, he was used to utilizing something called the law of averages. And until this time, averages had never been applied to people. It had never been applied to society. Here's what he knew. If he wanted to see how fast Saturn would actually travel in space, what he and his colleagues would do is they would put a little piece of tape, or they would etch in the end of their telescope a line. And they would wait to see how long it took for the planet to move across that line. They would time it, and then they would send that time into a journal that would collect all of the times and would average all of those times together, thereby giving you the average, which was, in this situation, perfect, or at least as close to perfect as we were going to get. And Quetelet said, why can't we do that with people? We need to be able to determine what the average man does in order to find the most perfect man, the most perfect woman, the most perfect sense of whatever's going on. And so Quetelet really started to average people for the first time ever. He talked about the average suicide rate. He talked about the average poor, the average rich person, the average salary. That had never been done before. He was brought before kings and queens and presidents, and other countries brought him in to establish all sorts of things around society. He was sent all around the world because of this really groundbreaking idea. He was the one who said the determination of the average man is not merely a matter of speculative curiosity. It may be of the most important service to the science of man and the social system. He thought this was how we could corral all the problems that we were having. A generation later, some new people came on the scene, and they were really looking to see how averagarianism, which was now fairly well accepted in the scientific community and even societally, how averagarianism could be used to build out infrastructure. The Industrial Revolution was about to get started, and they wanted to be able to use averages in order to better ourselves as people. We could measure things based on averages, but there was one big difference. Galton and Taylor, who you see here, they said it's not about the average being close to perfect, like Cattolé said. They said that's the one thing he got wrong. Actually, being better than average is what makes a person superior. They also then began to note, and they were deep ethnocentric nationalists. They said that if you are superior at one thing, you're likely superior at most things. And if you are not, and you can see the quote, if you're an imbecile in one general area, you're probably an imbecile in general. That is actually the precipice, that was the foundational support that they started to create school around. Because Galton and Taylor were directly influential in how schools started to get built out. Now, that may seem weird and strange to you now and today, hearing that we were basing everything on averages so as to try to figure out how to get better. But this is really something that we didn't start to unpack and start to find problems with really until about the 50s. There were a couple studies that came out in the 20s and 30s that said that may not be the best way to think, but it was in the 50s that we really started to figure this out, and I'll explain why in a second. But here's how I tried to explain this when we were live. I said, look, we've got averages all around us. Average height, average shoe size. Let's see how many averages we have in our room today. So let's see if we can apply this, and then I'll go back in, Kate, and I'll answer your question of how could that be a theory for teaching and learning. So here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to just ask everybody who's on the chat, please just give a yes or a no if this applies to you, okay? So if height, if you are a male and you're between 5'9" and 5'11", or if you're a female between 5'4" and 5'6", everybody in the chat just put, in fact, don't worry about no, just put yes if that applies to you. All right, already we're not doing so well. We've only got 2 yeses so far. All right, let's see what happens. For those of you who said yes to the height thing, if your shoe size is between 10 and 11 for a male or 8.5 to 9.5 for a female, say yes again. All right, we got 1. So Mike, if you weigh between 193 and 198, can you say yes? Oh, you're out. And we're done. And see, those kinds of lists don't make sense if you think about averagarianism. How is that possible? That's the average. That's supposed to apply to most people. That's supposed to be what the norm is. But as you can see, it doesn't work that way. And I didn't even get to eye color, household income, or the amount of money sitting in somebody's wallet right this instant. And that is just physical. What if I had gone into psychographic and I had asked about your favor of the death penalty or whether or not you believe in spanking of children? Well, see, they made a pretty big flaw when they started averaging people. They started averaging something that really can't be averaged. Let's see if I can't show you where this really started to unravel. By the way, much of this comes from Todd Rose in his book, The End of Average, which I highly recommend. He's out of Harvard. It's an excellent read, excellent description of how detrimental this kind of thinking can be. So in the 1950s, we were losing planes at a regular clip. In fact, one day the military lost 17 of these supersonic jets that cost millions of dollars. They lost 17 in a single day, and they couldn't figure out why. So they started to do what ended up being the largest research study of its kind. They said, look, we haven't built a cockpit for a pilot since the 20s, and we think maybe people have grown since then, people look different at this time. So we think maybe the cockpit's out of order, and that's why they can't get to the controls on time. So they wanted to see if that was true. So they started to measure all kinds of things. They measured arm length, they measured your chest or backside, they measured how far it was from your eyes back to the back part of your neck. They had 9 different measures that they wanted to see what that would look like, so they could create the ultimate cockpit. They could create it based on the average pilot. And what they found is what you can probably imagine they found. They didn't have an average pilot. Of those 9 factors, they couldn't find, of the 4,063 pilots that were studied, none of them had all 9 in common. They didn't have 8 in common, they didn't have 7 in common, they didn't have 6, they didn't have 5, they didn't have 4 in common. It was only when you got to 3 of the things that they measured that you found 3 of those pilots that shared all 3 of those averages. They found out what you now really suspect: there's no such thing as an average pilot. Now, what they did with that was the military said, oh my gosh, we've been thinking about this all wrong. Plane manufacturers, you need to build us cockpits that are adjustable. Things where we can, move the steering wheel back and forward, where we can rack the seat back over, stuff that you and I take for granted today. Now, you should know, when they first said that, the military contractors said, you're crazy. That can't happen. It's too expensive. It'll never work. And then within about a month or 2, they figured out how to do things that we just use every day in our cars, because there's no such thing as an average driver. See, what that theory was, and Kate, you asked, how could this be a theory for anything, especially education? They had forgotten ergodic theory. Ergodic theory is the notion, and it's often used in science with gases, that if you're going to average 2 things, those 2 things have to have 2 principles in common. They have to be exactly the same, and they have to stay exactly the same. That doesn't work for people. It certainly might work for gases in chemistry, but it doesn't work for humans. Humans are not the same, which is why if I ask you this question, who is bigger, it's a ludicrous question, and you know it. There's no real good way to answer it. Even if I were to give you measurements of averages, it doesn't help. It doesn't mean that you can tell me which one of these men is bigger, because there's no such thing as an average person. Just like there's no such thing as an average student. The concept of the average student really is a myth. So these 2 girls are essentially the same in terms of a score if you were to give them one, but they're very, very different in terms of what they're good at and what they're not good at. So when you start looking at individual students themselves, there is no such thing as average. But by the way, there's also no such thing as an average teacher. There's also no such thing as an average college or university. It just doesn't work that way. We all have different needs, we all have different abilities, we all have different propensities, just as Bonita and Kate are saying. We have to go back to the beginning, back to the drawing board, and think about how we're going to take this. Now, the reason that I say that is because, as I alluded to, these are the guys that architected school. In fact, you can look and see what John D. Rockefeller, who really was invested in education, because he, as the largest owner of manufacturing in the United States at that time, he wanted better workers. He didn't like how we set up our workers. So what did he say? He said, look, I'm going to create the education board, and we're going to try not to make these people, or any of their children, philosophers or men of learning or science. Instead, the task that we have set before ourselves is very simple, as well as very beautiful. We will organize our children into a little community and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. It does explain a lot, doesn't it? Now, Rockefeller was working very closely with the president at the time, and Wilson, who said just before he took office, he said this when he was still the president of Princeton. He said, look, we want one class of persons to have a liberal education. We want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity in every society, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks. That's what the goal was for school. That's what the goal was for education. And how did they do that? They took Cathalay's ideas as filtered through Galton and Taylor. They took the ideas that Rockefeller knew that the country needed, that Wilson believed the country needed, and they handed it over to guys like Edwin Cubberley. Now, Cubberley actually is the man who built public education as we know it. And in 1900, I'm going to show you one more quote from a person who's long dead, but I want you to see just how powerful this quote is. All focus must remain at the front for the teacher, the chalkboard, and the information. The students will be in rows, quietly reading books and absorbing information, only speaking when spoken to, and only taking breaks when bells ring. Promoting isolation and fear will create the working class American needs. Our classrooms were built. They were built to scare kids and even adults now, to scare students into feeling alone and to taking comfort in there being a manager at the front, into taking comfort in the bells ringing, into taking comfort in the process of their desks of reading quietly. That's how school was built. My question then is, how is school different today? Because we have very different outcomes in mind, don't we? We want everybody to be a critical thinker. We want everybody to be a person of learning, a person of letters or a science, as was in that previous quote. That we want everybody to be a problem solver. But we didn't set up school to give everybody those skills. We set up school to make everybody compliant. We set up school to make sure that people would do what they were told so that we had a large class of blue-collar workers. That's how we built school. How are you overcoming that? Yes, Mike, that is exactly how people accept as the norm because it's been that way for so long. We just have to change the way that we think about it. If you really want to look at some people who are going out on a ledge to talk about that, I think of George Siemens. George Siemens says, "I wonder when it will become illegal to teach by lecture. No longer worthy of the placebo effect in experiments. The mounting evidence is so clear that active learning strategies are better in every measurable way. I wonder when do no harm will be invoked in the classroom." When is that first lawsuit going to come from a student who was bored to tears? It's kind of scary to think about, right? Now, what do we do about that? Well, first of all, I hope that your classrooms don't look like a classroom. I know plenty of teachers who reconfigure and change the space and do more peer-to-peer and things like that. But there are some things that we can do pedagogically speaking as well. I think about Dan Meyer and what I call something he does, I call it do education. The reason I call it do education is from the old mantra of tell, show, do, review, and ask. And the reason I say do education is because I think we put the wrong word first. We put tell first. And so what do? We tell, and we tell, and we tell, and we tell, and we tell. Instead, we have a ton of research now. Books like Make It Stick show this. Dan Meyer is an excellent practitioner of this. How People Learn talks about this. We need to start with do. Some people call it priming. We talk about the notion of interleaving, but basically the concept of do first education can be shown very well with this picture. This is the California State Standard Test. Now, Dan Meyer was a junior and senior high science and math teacher before he went to Stanford to get his master's and his doctorate in instructional design. But what he would do is he would take his classroom full of students who, by the way, they're typical Americans. They hate science and math. They don't believe themselves to be good at science and math because that's what they've been told their entire lives. It's boring. It's not something you'll ever need. It's not something you have to worry about. We have reading across the curriculum. We have writing across the curriculum. Nobody has math across the curriculum. It's not that important. So he had a room full of people who believed themselves not to be good at math, which we also know to be ludicrous, but that's what they believed to be true. And he takes this California State test question, and he asks a couple of important questions. First of all, he says, this question has everything held within that you need in order to figure out the answer. When does that ever happen in real life? Ever. That your boss comes up and says, hey, I've got a problem for you to deal with. Here's X and Y and Z. Now just do the configuration and figure it out. Never, right? Never. At the same time, he says, why do we start with the tell? Because that's what has to happen here. I need to tell you about it. I need to give you some context. I need to tell you what you should do. No, 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 no. He says, take all this out and let's just start here. And ask your students a question that doesn't necessarily rely on math, because remember, they hate math. So instead say, hey, which one of these skiers is going up the steepest incline? I think it's A, Mr. Meyer. And then another student goes, no, 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 it's C, Mr. Meyer. And then there's a little debate, right? Because now they're putting a guess on the record. No, it's A, no, it's C, no, it's A, no, it's C. And then finally, one student will say, Mr. Meyer, how far forward are they going? And he'll say, well, why do you want to know that? Well, if I know how far forward they're going, I think I can start to tell which one of those inclines is going to be best. So he describes how to do that. They argue a little bit more. Then someone says, well, then it has to be A. No, 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 then it has to be C. And then finally someone goes, this is silly. We don't need to just know how far forward they're going. Don't we also need to know how tall that mountain is? Well, why do you need to know that? Well, because if I know how tall the mountain is and I know how far forward they're going, at that point, can't I calculate an angle? And he'll look at him and go, wait, you want to calculate an angle? You hate math. Why do you want to do that? And they'll go, I guess I do want to calculate an angle. The question is, are there apps that align within Canvas that can be leveraged within our classrooms for more active learning? I'll tell you, at St. Leo, we actually built out an ecosystem that had a tool that I absolutely love called Metal. It's an open source tool. It's out of Australia. It came out of Monash University. And it allows for the same kind of interactive action that I'm doing here, except it's two-way. It's not just the teacher or the professor doing the drawing, it's the student also doing the drawing. And then the teacher can come along and correct or identify or give ideas, whatever it might be. I highly recommend Metal. But the basis for all of that is not tell, show, do, review, ask. Again, we got it wrong. It should be do first. Do, show, tell, review, ask. Now, if you recall, if you were here in person, this is when I had everybody stand up and we actually started marching in place and we started moving around and we started saying back and forth to one another, do, then the other person said show, then tell, then review, then ask. And we did that for about 60 seconds or so, getting faster and louder as we went. Why? Because we know that movement is good for the brain. It makes what's going on with the context of the word stickier because there's more than one input. There's more than one part of the brain being used. So do, starting there, and then showing, and then telling, and then reviewing, and then asking, that's a much better order for learning. That's not a better order for instructing or for lecturing, because lecturing relies on tell first. But if learning is what you're after, if you want to get past what the history of our discipline really comes out of, if you want to get to an outcome where the students learn, then do, show, tell, review, ask is your way there. That's the first connection killer. That really dovetails nicely into this concept of teaching and learning that I also want to talk about as a connection killer. And to do that, I like to talk about neuroscience. Now, I am not a neuroscientist. I have never put a wafer inside of an incision in the brain that I've made. I just report on neuroscience that has been detailed by other people. I very much like John Medina and the work he's doing with brain rules. He would argue that there are 12 things that we can replicate over and over and over again that we know to be true about the brain, so why don't we use those 12 things religiously? But unfortunately, we don't. But I'm going to give you a basic framework based on that sort of stuff. And it's something that I call learning cocktails. We know that if you want to get somebody from being a novice up to being an expert, then you need to do a couple of things. Now, the frame that I'm using here is based on Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, and he was the one who identified this particular axis with skill at one end and challenge at the other. And if you've got those things in mind, then here's a couple of things, first of all, that we want to avoid. We want to avoid glutamate. Glutamate is this ugly little neurotransmitter. It's actually quite necessary much of the time, but it's bad when it gets to be too much. Glutamate lives down here in the base of your spine, and it will actually come out when you have moments of anxiety. And what it will literally do is it will begin to eat neurons. So, sort of like Pac-Man, It will actually eat the things you need in order to think or learn. Now, this is probably useful in our brains because if you're walking down a path and a bear jumps out at you, you don't need to take the time to figure out why that bear is there. There's no time to think about that. Instead, you just need to run, right? But glutamate is one of those things that can really harm a person when they feel anxious. Because when they feel too much anxiety, they actually stop thinking and stop learning. So we want to avoid glutamate, meaning we don't want to have so much challenge that a person feels overwhelmed. At the same time, we want to avoid cortisol. Cortisol, you may remember, Time magazine talks about it, 2020 has done stories on it. It is sometimes called the killer hormone. It is a hormone, a neurotransmitter that actually, when it surges into your bloodstream, it can make you overeat, undereat, oversleep, undersleep. It literally begins to kill a person. Interestingly, researchers have found that after about 7 minutes of boredom, people are engorged with cortisol. So boring lectures are literally killing people. That's something to think about, isn't it? We want to avoid those two extremes. Instead, we want to focus on the flow that comes in the middle. And that flow starts with serotonin. Serotonin is really, I think about it as the stasis neurotransmitter. It happens, you have it, it's like grease for your brain, like grease for the engine of your brain. It happens to come out when you've gotten enough sleep, when you've eaten well, when you've had exercise. It's really, really, really powerful. When you've got serotonin in place, all the rest of these are easier to fall in place. And by the way, it's harder to find glutamate and cortisol in somebody's system when serotonin is really quite present. So it's good. It is a good reason to keep meetings short. That's very true. After the serotonin, and by the way, the reason I put this here is not because we can control this with our students. Obviously we can't. Or maybe we can control or at least help a little bit with the eating perhaps, or perhaps with the exercise, maybe. But telling your students to sleep, I get how weird and difficult that is. However, how many students know this? How many students understand what that does for them in terms of their day, their time, their ability to think? We don't really talk about this stuff. And I think that we should. We should give them that kind of information so that they can be armed with it and at least make better decisions potentially if they have it. But after the serotonin, now we get into the stuff we can control. Norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is created when your brain believes there to be conflict, or disequilibrium is probably a better word because conflict is always associated with negative stuff. Disequilibrium is just something doesn't jive, something's not right. But at the same time, it is the novelty creator. It makes us want to figure it out. What is going on there? Why is that happening? Why is it like that? Now again, if that disequilibrium is so great that it creates too much challenge, that creates anxiety. I can't figure that out. I could never do that. That's too hard. At the same time, if there's no challenge at all, it creates cortisol. It's boring. Who cares? But if you can create that compelling question, that compelling argument, that thing that makes a student go, yeah, why is that like that? Dan Meyer does it this way. He will take a camera out and shoot him, watch him shooting basketballs into a basketball hoop. And he'll take one of the shots and he'll let the ball strobe up in the air. So the ball will literally strobe up halfway and then it will stop. And the basket's over here. And he'll ask his students, is that ball going to go in? Now, again, it's not a math question. That's an opinion. I have an opinion on that. Sure. Yeah, I think it's going to go in. Or no, I don't think it's going to go in. The arc and the trajectory don't look right in order for it to go in the hoop. Well, that's the creation of norepinephrine. He's creating this equilibrium that's not so challenging they can't figure it out, but it's also not boring because they kind of want to know. Then he gives them the tools like GeoGebra, which is a free geometry tool that you can download. And he shows them how to actually figure out the arc of that basketball. And then he simply plays the clip to show them, yeah, it went in or no, it didn't go in. You want to create norepinephrine in your audience that makes them wonder what's about to happen. I got to figure this out. I got to know. I got to understand how this is going to end. After that, dopamine becomes crucial. Dopamine is essentially the neurotransmitter that's associated with confidence, meaning I believe I can figure it out. I believe I can get that thing that created the norepinephrine. I can figure that out. I can make it work. I can understand it. I can gather it. I can put it into a package. I can make sense of it. I can put this puzzle together. That's what we want to do. If we do that, if we can convince students that they can get there, and by the way, this is completely based in the growth mindset, which Carol Dweck, and I'll show you that book here in a little bit, talks about the need to believe that you can do something, the need to believe you can get there, the need to believe you can learn. You can learn math. Anybody can learn math unless they have a specific disability. Anybody can do that. And that really leads to endorphins. Endorphins are those euphoric neurotransmitters that come out when you figure something out, when you actually get it for the first time. Did you know that when a person puts together a pattern for the very first time, dopamine and endorphins are released at the same moment in your brain? That only happens with one other thing, and it's a Title IX violation to talk about. That's the only other time that we feel endorphins and dopamine released at the same time. Can you imagine that feeling for education? Because that would make students want to do it over and over and over again. And that's pretty exciting. Those learning cocktails are how we start to get there. But remember, it's not just about learning. 75% of why students leave have nothing to do with academic problems. They have to do with context problems. They have to do with outside issues, like the stuff that Matthew Lieberman has researched at UCLA. Matthew Lieberman is the man who wrote the book Social, and he believes that we actually have a social part of the brain. That's what you see here in the red. And that part of the brain is literally connected from the moment that a person awakens. It's trying to find another person to connect with. Now, it's not just anybody. It's got to be someone you want to connect with. But we, as humans, are wired to try to find somebody to connect with. The only time that it disconnects is when we are given a task. And it's got to be an independent, autonomous task. We do that task, and then the millisecond that it's done, we reconnect and try to find somebody that we can be social with. That's the power of socialness. Now, Lieberman wanted to see just how powerful this was, and so he constructed an experiment called E-ball. E-ball looked something like this. You were brought into his lab, and they put an fMRI hat on you, and they said they wanted to measure your brain as you simply had a catch. You were in control of that single hand there in the middle of the screen. So basically, what they said was, you don't know the other two people, just have a catch. We just want to see what happens. Play ball. So people would do it. They then got tricky. Matthew Lieberman and the other researchers, about 2 or 3 minutes in, they actually stopped throwing the ball to you. They actually never threw the ball to you again. Now, if you're like me, the very first time that I saw this, it was uncomfortable. It was almost painful to say, come on, throw them the ball. Just throw the ball. That's rude. Don't be rude. Include them. Help them. Support them, right? But they never did. That discomfort that I felt as an audience member, the person controlling that hand felt after about 7 seconds. And pretty soon, their system was engorged with frustration, and they actually saw something interesting on the fMRI machine. They saw a part of the brain light up that they weren't really prepared for. The part of the brain that lit up was the same part of the brain that feels physical pain. Feeling social pain in our brains is the same thing as feeling physical pain. You stub your toe, you hit your thumb with a hammer, that's the same in your brain's perception as being snubbed socially. In fact, they went on to find out that you can actually quell social pain by taking Tylenol. It actually limits your glutamate. It makes you not feel quite so anxious about it. Socialness matters to us. Socialness is powerful and important. So my question to you is this: how social are your classrooms? How social is your online classroom? How social is your face-to-face classroom? Do you give people frameworks and experiences that allow them to be social together? Because what Lieberman found out was that if you can take tasks and associate them with socialness, very good things happen in the brain. People remember better, they learn better, they have much more in the way of comprehension. Mike, the implications of this are really crucial. So the question is, back to the instructors and the instructional designers, how much socialness do we have in our classes? When we talk about professional development for learning, for teaching and learning, we almost always focus on cognition. Now, that professional development, I think, should look something like this. We should be talking about how people learn, and now you see it by Kathy Davison. Mindset is one of the most important educational texts of the last decade. It's crucial that people be reading that. Make it stick. Everyone should understand how that works. We should be able to speak eloquently to things like this when it comes to cognition. But it's not just about cognition. Now, cognition itself, I'll just use the example of frame and mechanic. They're two of my favorites. I'll talk about that for a second. But when you talk about frame and mechanic and really understanding what that means, the place I got that from is how people learn. They talk about the frame, they talk about the mechanic. Now, when you talk about frame and mechanic, let's see if I can describe this to you. The mechanics can pretty quickly be described through the concept of the Karate Kid. Do you guys remember the Karate Kid? Wax on, wax off, paint the fence, down, up. The challenge that I always throw out when I talk about this, because this movie, in my perspective, other than Elizabeth Shue, who I had a tremendous crush on when I was 16 and I watched this movie, other than that, this was a horrible film. Horrible. Not the acting, Ralph Macchio's fine and Mr. Miyagi was great, but the concept is absolutely opposed to learning. It's wrong, because here's what it said. I can take you and for 2 or 3 days, I can give you the mechanics of a specific movement. I can get you to do all the wax on, wax off, all that stuff. Then you can practice it for another week or 2, and then afterward, I'm going to stick you in the ring with a black belt who has been practicing karate for 10, 15, 20 years, and you'll be able to hold your own. If you want to take that challenge, I would love to watch what happens. Now, I think, unfortunately, afterward, I'll be visiting you in a hospital room when you get your jaw broken because you don't know what you're doing. It doesn't work that way. This is the transactional model of learning. I show it to you, I teach you, and you've experienced it, you practice it a few times, good to go, you've got it. You know it doesn't work that way. The other way that I try to explain this, I say, look, if mechanics is what it's all about, if it's just about passive absorption, but it's just about being exposed to something, then which one of these pennies is correct? So you guys can take a second, look at them. One of these is the correct version of a penny. A penny we've seen thousands of times, right? We know what a penny looks like. So which one of these is right? You've been exposed to it over and over and over and over again. Surely we will all get it right. But as I do this experiment with audience after audience after audience, it's usually in the 20% range you get it. And quite honestly, I think most of the time they're guessing. There, by the way, is the correct version of the penny. When we just learn the mechanics, but we don't learn the frame that sits behind it, when we just learn the what, but not the why, do students really learn? From a neuroscientific perspective, brain scientists would say no, they have not learned. You can really see this in the book Lies My Teacher Told Me. So Lowen writes this book about what college students or incoming college students know to be true about history. And how he determines this is he takes his students, 800 or 900 students every semester, and he tests them to see if what they know about history is collective. And so basically, here's what he says. He says, look, if 80% or more of my students say something is true, then I believe that they have learned that to be true. Whether it is true or not doesn't matter. That's what they believe to be true. And so here's what he does. There's a section on Columbus. Here's what incoming freshmen say they know to be true about Columbus. That Columbus was born in Genoa to poor Italian parents. He developed great navigation skills. He was the only one who really knew the world wasn't flat, and he therefore convinced the king and the queen to let him take the back route because the Middle Eastern route had been cut off. So he convinced them to give him the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, which were poor, barely outfitted ships. They fought weather all the way across the Atlantic, and then the sailors were scared so much of falling off the edge of the earth that they almost mutinied. These are 5 things that freshmen in college say they know to be true about Columbus because they learned these things in high school. The question, of course, is how many of them are true? Now, I think everyone in the audience right now was in the original audience, so I'm assuming you remember the answer, maybe not. What I'd love for you to put down is, when I had you get with other people, how many of the answers did people say were true? Just put 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 that they believed of these answers that were true. Let's see in the chat what people say. A lot of 3s. That's what I hear a lot. All right, we'll go with 3. I think a lot of people. 1 was true. 3, yeah. 3, 3, 1, 3, 3. Okay. Yeah, that's because they're guessing. That's right. So after they put a guess on the record, then I usually go in and show them what that book says is correct. And this is now from first citations rather than 6-degree separated citations that we're getting the information. So here's what we actually know. Columbus was probably not Italian. The reason we know that is because he could not write in Italian. However, he wrote very well in Spanish, and he even wrote pretty well in Portuguese. So he was either Spanish or Portuguese, but he claimed to be Italian. Many people believe because he was likely Jewish, and Jewish people were not allowed captaincies of boats. So he lied and said, since I look Jewish, I also look Italian, and therefore that's how he got the captaincy. That's what most people think. But we're 99% sure he was not Italian. At the same time, almost everybody at that time knew the world was not flat. This had been known for thousands of years in some cultures. The Egyptians knew it, the Mesopotamians knew it, the Chinese knew it. A lot of different people knew that the world was not flat. But in Europe, they had known this for 200 or 300, 400 years. It was common. Those Middle East routes, wide open. Everybody was free to come and go. The Turks were not blocking anything. That was just not true. The 3 ships were quite well outfitted. They were huge, actually, for the day. And the weather was perfect. You know how we know the weather was perfect? Because his journal, Columbus's own journal, said the weather has been strangely quiet this whole time. There was no weather. The reason that textbooks put bad weather into the story is to create disequilibrium. They're trying to create some kind of conflict that's safe, because they don't want people, to worry about being offended by this national hero and whatever. So they say, oh, there must have been bad weather. There wasn't any bad weather. But students learned that mechanic, that piece, incorrectly. The sailors were not upset at all. They thought they were going to be rich, and they were interested in becoming rich, which ultimately led to the biggest lie of all, that he discovered America. He discovered nothing. There were people here long before he was here, not to mention the people that lived here, but there were other explorers who had been here. There was a coin from 1100 found in Salt Lake City recently. There were people that were here from other places. He didn't discover anything. If you're looking for disequilibrium rather than weather, what you could share with them are the words from Columbus's own journal. Columbus actually wrote this to a friend in 1500 about rewarding dignitaries and lieutenants with native women to rape. It is very general, and there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand. If you really want to get to some disequilibrium, you can look at what was happening. You can look at first citation sources rather than 60-degree separated sources. But just remember the point. Students learned incorrectly. They learned wrong. But they know the mechanics because they were told to memorize them over and over and over and over again. And so they actually learned the things incorrectly. And not only did they not know the mechanics right, therefore, they don't know what the frame means. They don't know about the historicity of that and why that matters as we move forward. So as you start thinking about a catalyst for learning, the frame becomes really important, not just the mechanics. Now, the way that I tried to illustrate the frame was I talked about a magic trick. I had gotten a video for Christmas. My daughter got it for me about how to do magic tricks. And so I did this little magic trick for people. I'll do it with you now. You can try it again for those of you that are watching live. I'm going to show you some cards. I want you to pick one card. You're only going to see them for a couple of seconds. Pick one card and remember it. Don't forget it. All right, so pick that one card. You got a couple seconds. Pick it now. All right, I hope that you picked your card. Now, I then talk about how miraculous it would be if I was able to read your minds, if all of you happen to pick the same card, and then I was able to take that card away, to remove that card from you. That would be quite remarkable as a magician, wouldn't it? And so then I show you the cards and I say, has your card been removed? The answer is yes. Your card has been removed. And it's amazing. It's miraculous. And so I then ask this important question. since I have seen this video that shows a handful of tricks that I understand conceptually how they work, would you pay the $160 that it costs to go see Penn and Teller to instead come and see me do a magic act? And then, of course, I say anybody who takes me up on that is both foolish and the show will be tonight at 7. I'll take your money. Because I've not practiced magic my entire life. I don't have patter down. I know the frame behind 10 tricks. I understand how they work, but I haven't done them over and over and over again. That magic show would be awful. It would be horrible, in fact. We need to understand the frame and the mechanic if we actually want to make sense of something and say we have learned it. Now, the way that this trick works, by the way, it's super simple. I showed you cards, and then I changed all of them in the next bit. So when you start talking about professional development for cognition, mechanic and frame are important. But again, it's not just about that. It's also about affection and about conation. These are the kinds of books that you want to consider when you think about the learning triangle. And the learning triangle has cognition, affection, and conation. That's what it takes for somebody to really learn holistically. You've got to understand what motivates people. You've got to understand what it takes for them to believe that they can learn something. You've got to understand the social nature of the brain. We need to know about systems architecture and systems thinking. If you want to know affection, you've got to know about these things. You've got to know how important it is for people to find affinity, mentorship, support, and caring. If you want to talk about conation, people need resilience. They need motivation. They need grit. They need the growth mindset. We should be doing just as much professional development around this stuff as we are around cognition. Because again, 3/4 of the reason students struggle is because of this stuff, not because of the other. And yet, if we spend our professional development hours on it, which most of the time we don't, most subject matter experts in higher education spend their professional development capital studying their subject matter. Mathematicians study math, scientists study science. Historians get together at conferences with other historians. They don't necessarily talk about how to teach that stuff better. They just talk about history or math or science. Well, in this case, if we're going to spend our capital doing professional development about cognition or affection or conation, that's how we're actually going to help our students. When I was at St. Leo, I helped build out a system that would actually create infrastructure for this very thing. Now, we had all the tools that you would expect. We had D2L was our learning management system. We were utilizing smart thinking for tutoring. We had Salesforce with our CM. We were using these things. But notice, all of it sat up on a platform that was around socialness, that was around engagement. So there's that metal tool I was talking about. UCrew is the same as Campus, which is where I happen to be a chief academic officer right now, that set up a platform for people to be connected. We wanted to create an ecosystem, an environment where people could actually connect, where they could connect with tools, where they could connect with groups, where they could connect with content and applications, and they could connect with one another. That's what we wanted to build out, so that it wasn't just about learning, it was about all the things that empower and enable learning. It wasn't just about any one facet, it was holistic. Yes, they could see the course mini feed, they could see the conversations going on in the LMS and remember to, hey, it's time for me to go back over in the LMS. I click there and I go there. But at the same time, they could get support, they could get help. You know, telling students to connect to academics is pretty disingenuous when I think the national average right now is over 5 times the average person changes their major. So we're telling them, connect to something that you're not gonna find valuable in about a semester. That doesn't work. Instead, find ways to get them to connect to people, to get them connect to events, causes, organizations, clubs, whatever it might be. Now we're starting to talk about well-rounded applications of learning. See, when we start talking about the things that I'm trying to devote my work to, Campus and the Institute for Interconnected Education, I think we can start to avoid some of these connection killers and our paradigm starts to change. I gave you a definition for learning at the start. I want to give you a better definition for learning and see if this doesn't resonate with some folks. This to me is how I define learning. Learning juxtaposes new and old in a process, and that word process is important, of discovery and pattern finding leading to transformation. I think when we start to look at that process as being holistic, as being enabled by some of the other things, that's when we start to really see learning happen. Not just short-term memorization, not just the ability to take a test and pass it, and then 3 months later not be able to pass that test because you've forgotten all of it. That's common. I'm talking about learning. The ability to apply what we have from a class and put it into real life, into work, to apply it to an internship, to apply it in an interview, to apply it to get a promotion, to actually use that stuff. Connecting things that people find are juxtapositions and finding ways to make those come together. That discovery of pattern finding at that point really does help them transform. I ended with this when we were talking. I talked about folding your hands incorrectly, and I made a joke about it. I talked about how you can look at the way that you put your thumb on the top, and which thumb up says something about you. It's not true. But if you remember, at the very end, I had people open their hands up and then fold their hands wrong. Their hands are still folded. It feels uncomfortable. But actually, what's interesting is when you fold your hands incorrectly, it's harder to pull them apart. It's harder for another person to pull them apart. And scientists believe that that's because there's so many nuances and new things happening with the muscles. What I've just shared with you is new. It's uncomfortable sometimes. It's weird. Because we're talking about things that are not just about cognition. We're not just talking about lecturing. We're talking about the transformation of the room. We're talking about the transformation of the presentation. We're talking about active learning. That is Education 3.0. But it also is far more powerful, far more effective than anything that we have put in front of our students to date. That's the presentation that I gave live. I hope that this was a little bit different for you in terms of the mode and the methodology here. You will get this presentation if you don't already have it. And note that it not only includes some nice resources, a video that I created when I was at the Academic Research Center. There's also some recommended reading, some people you might be interested in following. I hope that that is effective for you and that you come back and find it useful as you work. Thanks for your time.